The Israeli military has admitted killing a US-Turkish activist in the occupied West Bank. 26-year-old Aysenur Ezgi was shot in the head close to the town of Beita on Friday. She was participating in a protest against the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements. In a statement, the Israeli army says she was hit indirectly and unintentionally by soldiers who were aiming not at her, but at a key instigator. So the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called the killing unprovoked and unjustified. He says the Israeli army needs to make fundamental changes in their rules of engagement.
Her killing was both unprovoked and unjustified. No one should be shot and killed for attending a protest. No one should have to put their life at risk just for freely expressing their views. In our judgment, Israeli security forces need to make some fundamental changes in the way that they operate in the West Bank, including changes to their rules of engagement.
Okay, we'll have more on Antony Blinken's comments in a moment with Jonah Hull in London. But first, let's bring in Nida Ibrahim joining us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. So, Nida, just tell us a little bit more about what this Israeli investigation has found.
Well, the Israeli forces are saying that they might have hit Aisha unintentionally, that she was not a target. But every witness we've been speaking to from Beita or from the international activists who attended that protest negate this version that has been published in a statement by the Israeli army. They say that at the time of the shooting, there was no confrontations happening between the Palestinian protesters and the Israeli forces who were there. This is a site that Palestinians often go to protest. Israeli settlers often taking over Palestinian lands. And we've been seeing at least 17 protesters being killed in the past few years during these protests. This time, the target or the person who has lost her life was Aysenur Ezgi. But as far as Palestinians are concerned, they say that this is done intentionally to curb and suppress these Palestinian protests that aim to regain and reclaim back the land that has been taken by Israeli settlers. And Palestinian activists we've been speaking to say that it was not a coincidence that Aysenur was targeted. They say that the killing was intentional to send a message to everyone who wants to support Palestinians or international activists who want to show solidarity with Palestinians should think twice and three times before coming here to the occupied West Bank. Let me tell you that at the funeral we attended in Nablus, we spoke to some of her colleagues in the ISM movement, the International Solidarity Movement that has been bringing international activists for a long time. They say that yes, they are afraid, yes, they know the risks and the dangers, but they are vowing and they are promising to continue supporting the Palestinians. Many of them say that they were really affected by Israel's war on the besieged Gaza Strip and that war on Gaza has moved them to come and see and help. Yes, they cannot enter the besieged Gaza Strip right now, so they are here in the occupied West Bank trying to support Palestinians as they not only battle the armed Israeli settlers, but the Israeli military that often comes to Palestinian villages to offer protection to these armed settlers.
Okay, Nida, thank you for that reporting from Ramallah on the occupied West Bank. So as we've been saying, the Secretary of State, Blinken, was asked about this at a press conference in London. Let's bring in Jonah Hull. He's joining us from there. So tell us more about what Blinken had to say about this.
Well, he was speaking opposite the Foreign Secretary David Lammy here in London at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office behind me in about the last hour, asked by an attending journalist whether he accepted the US Secretary of State Israel's version of events that the killing of that US citizen in the West Bank had been unintentional, albeit quite possibly the result of Israeli military fire. And he said, well, pretty clearly that he didn't. Israeli forces need to make changes, he said, in the way they operate in the West Bank, including to their rules of engagement. He made the point that this is the second time this has happened to a US citizen in very similar circumstances. The second, of course, the first rather, was our own Shireen Abu Akleh back in 2022, killed by an Israeli military bullet during a raid in the Jenin refugee camp. At that time, the Israeli military suggested she'd been killed in confusion and crossfire, but under intense international pressure. They subsequently admitted a high probability that she'd been killed by Israeli fire, but that fire had been accidental. So a very similar set of language being used in this instance. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, saying that is not acceptable. It has to change. We'll make that clear to the most senior members of the Israeli government. There are serious issues to be dealt with, he said, and we will make it clear that they need to be dealt with.
And Jonah, on any potential Gaza ceasefire deal, what did Blinken and Lammy have to say on that?
Well, both men were adamant that both sides are working very determinedly to end the war. A ceasefire agreement, getting a ceasefire agreement over the finish line, said Mr. Blinken, was the best way to bring the hostages home and get aid to those who need it most. He was asked whether essentially the ceasefire talks were in deadlock, and he said, well, look, 90% of a deal is done. 90% of issues are agreed. There are just a handful, not even a handful, he said, of issues left, but getting that last 10% done is the hardest part. But he was sure that all the remaining issues were fully resolvable, albeit the hardest ground, he said, to cover. He said the mediators, along with the US, that's Qatar and Egypt, of course, were working very hard to bridge the gaps, and he suggested that they might be able to put a new deal to the parties pretty soon.
I think what is evident, though, is the strong interest that everyone in the region has in being able to get the ceasefire concluded. It's clearly in Israel's interest. It's in its interest to get hostages home. It's in its interest to turn down the temperature in Gaza. It's in its interest to have possible off-ramps in the north with Hezbollah and Lebanon that a ceasefire in Gaza would make more possible. It's in its interest to also further enable us to calm the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthis. And it's in its interest because it opens other prospects that could fundamentally alter Israel's security for the long term.
Okay, we'll now speak to Menachem Klein, who's a professor of political science at Bar-Milan University, joining us from West Jerusalem. Thanks for your time. Can I first get your reaction on Israel coming out and saying, look, yes, we admit to killing this US-Turkish citizen, but it was certainly not intentional? I mean, are they trying to draw a line under this, hoping that it will just go away because of the pressure that was put on them to find out exactly what happened?
Good afternoon. It seems that the Israeli administration tries to manage the crisis much better than the previous one, with following the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank. But I doubt if this will help Israel vis-à-vis the United States. It seems that Israeli army commanders lost control over its snipers. And the command is very, very weak. And Israel must deal much better with its forces posted in the West Bank and using live fire there. The Israeli army used to operate in the West Bank, and recently we saw that in Jenin, in Tulkarem, in the same methods as the Israeli army uses in Gaza. Unfortunately, Secretary Blinken did not condemn the Israeli army operations and the methods used in Gaza.
So then, how challenging will it be for Israel and its forces to, according to what Blinken had to say standing in London, he said fundamental changes need to be made in the way that they operate in the West Bank, including changes to their rules of engagement, and also who will enforce these changes?
Very good question. The United States must impose on Israel these changes. follow them very, very closely and impose on Israel those changes in the operational mode the IDF uses. Without that, Israel will fool the Americans and mislead them. There is in the Israeli army, my impression is that there is a culture of covering up war crimes, both in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. It's not the first time. It's ongoing, and therefore Hague shows high interest in what's going on in the fight between Israel and the Palestinians.
Right. Let me just ask you your thoughts on another topic that was addressed by Secretary of State Blinken and the Foreign Secretary of the UK, David Lammy. I mean, they were speaking about a Gaza ceasefire. And Blinken said that a ceasefire deal is 90% agreed. But we also know that Netanyahu was speaking to American media earlier this week, and he said, quote, unfortunately, it's not close. So for two allies, the messaging coming out is starkly different. How do you explain this?
I explained it that Secretary Blinken relates to the minor issues. The fundamental issues are those 10% that he did not mention. And the most fundamental issue is that Netanyahu is uninterested to finish the war and have a permanent ceasefire, nor a temporary ceasefire. The debate between Netanyahu and the army, including Minister of Defense Gallant, is on temporary ceasefire and hostages deal first stage, one stage, and one-step deal. Afterwards, the Israeli army wants to resume the fight, resume the war in Gaza Strip. There is no debate between the army and Netanyahu on permanent ceasefire. Unfortunately and mistakenly, the American administration hopes that by having one-step ceasefire, then miraculously the Israelis will agree to continue the ceasefire while negotiating the second stage and so on. Israel does not show any intention, any good intention, to have a permanent ceasefire and conclude successfully the second stage of the ceasefire.
Okay, Menachem Klein, thank you for speaking to us from West Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel, get the latest news from Al Jazeera.